Bernard de Montreal. Book Beyond the Mind. Chapter 14. The Ego. The ego can be defined as the summation of all psychological attitudes that block out its multidimensional experience. It feeds on impressions that serve in the development of the unconscious personality, and that either weaken or strengthen it, depending on the evolutionary status of the soul from which it gathers its psychic energy. It is contagious with astrally infiltrated thoughts from the soul plane that have moved down from the mental circuits. The soul memory infuses the personality with the energy currents that confine it to a diminished expression of the creative mind, and blocks the self from the awareness of a conscious thought contact with intelligence sources whose role is to forge the unity of the ego, the soul and the spirit to end the incarnation cycle. The unconscious ego does not participate in the real nature of its consciousness. It expresses a reduced self-awareness that is sacrificed to the mechanical operations of the subjective consciousness which crafts the personality. Personality is the total accumulation of impressions that mark egoic experience. It confronts the self with false premises as to the reality of its experience and corners it into a state of mind that does not allow it to consciously assist the ego-soul-spirit union. The ego cannot easily see into the occult nature of self-reality, and even less into the reality of its causal link or higher self-principle. Because its consciousness is veiled, the ego operates through a stereotyped memory that stifles the person or real self to benefit its personality or fictitious identity maintained by the ego's reflective process. Consciousness is born from the inner layers of self-reality. It dwarfs the ego's reflective impressions in relative proportion to its objective realization throughout the life experience. It is not egocentric in nature but rather fluid, and capable of participation in the creative process coining from the mental planes that secure link between the spirit or thought source, the soul or memory system, and the intellectual level, where differing degrees of reflection are enjoyed by the ego. Consciousness is a state of being that increases in proportion to the ego's non-interference with the creative pulse of the higher mind or mental plane from which it draws the highest thought vibrations. When the ego reflects on its inner reality subjectively, it falls behind in the understanding of the mechanics of consciousness and grows more and more isolated from the inner self. A dichotomy is created in the consciousness through thought habits, and consequently, their actions. As the ego espouses the contours of a consciousness that corresponds little to self-reality, It cannot be permeated by high mind resonance that would increase the level of awareness and allow for the radiation of creative forms of thought to uplift the self and free the ego from subjective reflection that clouds its mental state. The ego is consequent to the self-soul linkage. When the higher self is added to the linkage through the understanding of the laws of consciousness, the whole being emanates creative power that begins to fulfill its role in the evolution of man and his world. Until the self has seen through the egocentric thought habits that undermine its reality, the ego cannot accede to the state of mind it requires to fully understand life and acquire a permanent peace of mind. The perfect balance between the emotional and mental energy that makes up the reality of a person. Personality is the mask of the self and the illusions of the ego. As the self grows in awareness, personality leaves increasingly more room for the development of the person, actualized through a transparent ego and a more active self. With the development of a supramental consciousness, the true person begins to appear. A more permanent trend in the growth process of the whole being is felt. Relieving the ego from the gymnastics of the past and allowing it to finally acquire more and more certitude in the new state of mind that evolves through a heightened awareness of the illusions that had created its mirror image. Personality is most interesting in that it allows the ego the necessary leeway it needs to compete with other egos in ascertaining its own illusions. Personality is the image the ego needs in the world when dealing with enemies or friends. It is false assurance to which the ego entrusts its security, since it is made up of the egocentric reflections of the intellect that help foster the image it has of itself. The psyche is fashioned to an advanced degree through its connection with the astral plane. Because of our ignorance of the astral laws and their imperfections, we are victimized in the search for our real identity. Through the never-ending flow of subtle and not so subtle disinformation that assails our minds, entities thrive on our lack of self-knowledge and maintain an apparent but innocuous power over our psyche. Identity can only spring from the awareness of the source of our thoughts followed by the deastralization of the thought process. When the ego has achieved real identity, it is no longer affected by its astral energy or that of others. The self then becomes the center of the soul reality in psychic harmony with the higher self, the creative source of thought. The soul must be upgraded in its energy if it is to be free of its peripheral astral thoughts or egregore. This only happens when the egocentric thinking habits, formed throughout the unconscious phase of the development of the mind, have been eliminated. The unconscious ego is a limiting factor in the evolution towards consciousness. It engages its potential to fulfill needs that are a measure of its fictitious strength or weakness, depending on the spiritual status of the soul. It cannot through a weakened self dominate the inner forces of the soul. For lack of awareness of the powers at work that seek its domination through the astral connection, totally hidden and yet the most important element in unconscious mental life. Such a dire condition is sufficient to undermine the full development of consciousness and short-circuit creative intelligence. It is the cause behind the fundamental ignorance of the science of life and the karmic experience that forever confines us to existential suffering. The level of the ego's psychic awareness must be raised to sustain it through the difficult period wherein consciousness begins to indicate more than what is apparent. Memory is the sole support for egoic knowledge that would otherwise benefit from pre-personal, supramental communication with planes of intelligent life, that would open up awareness of the common bond that unifies the ego with the source of thought. The ego uses memory to support its illusion of the understanding of its experiential reality, leaving the self helpless in its isolation from its source. A barrier of egocentric opinions renders access to mind reality impossible. The self in substance is the center of the soul. It is the very core of its energy, the essence of which we are made of. When the soul is laden with too much obstructive and unnecessary memory, the self is unable to channel the forces emanating from higher spheres that seek union with it so as to give the ego the creative drive necessary for the fulfillment of a conscious destiny. Consciousness can be identified as a psychic self when it has dropped egocentricity that screens the subtle thought currents pouring in from psychic planes. It is essential to the ego's psychological equilibrium to eventually be able to use this thought energy to master disinformation that magnetizes the ego and increases its spiritual illusions. This is the last bridge to cross before contact with the higher mental planes of the conscious mind. The ego is not familiar with conscious thought and has a tendency to color its experience because of its spiritual naivety. The universe is a vast occult underground of forces that have to be controlled through an awareness that prevents naive meanderings of a consciousness filled with desires for spiritual elevation. Man is an intelligent being. He must be vigilant in the affairs of the world, and even more so in those of the psyche. Psychic thought is an addition to human consciousness. It is not easily accessible because of lack of understanding of the astral flaws in the mind. Once aware of pre-personal intelligences, the ego has to learn to deal with them in a communication similar to its physical experience. The forces at work on psychic planes must be mastered. Until the ego becomes aware of its contact consciousness, It remains a pawn in a cosmic gambit where astral whims have kept mankind from conscious communication for thousands of years. The conscious ego is a force in itself. It reaps a global vision that has the ability to see through the astral makeup of planetary consciousness. The problem with the modern as well as the ancient trends of spirituality lies in the fact that we have a tendency to take them for granted when in actual fact, they represent subtle forms of astral manipulation that can only be averted through increased awareness of the psychic flaws that underlie the construction of spiritual views. Evolutionary consciousness will counter the astral process of the mind. Collaboration with the forces of intelligent mind communication will be the basis of a balance created through an internal struggle for real freedom. The passive spiritual being, ignorant of the astral laws of the mind, will be transformed. Regaining control of his psychic self will mean increasing his awareness of the laws that govern the spiritual astrality of his consciousness. Astral consciousness is not of the living but of the world of the dead. Human consciousness must be freed from such an involutionary condition in order to increase free creative partnership with all planes of reality from where energy is drawn. Once the ways and the means of spiritual manipulation have been learned, the ego begins to comprehend the real self. The development of the self and his maintenance in a state of permanent equilibrium requires an ego-free mind, which means in full control of the quality of its thoughts. When such control has been achieved, the ego becomes conscious of the self and benefits creatively from thought contact with the mind planes from which the double or cosmic principle actualizes itself through the conscious self or soul center, down through the transparent ego, or real person, as opposed to personality. The ego is a lens through which mental or astral thoughts shape consciousness. When this lens has been sufficiently polished by life and awareness of the astral traps that accompany subjective thought, it develops an acute ability to perceive the fine registers of pre-personal intelligence, free from astral manipulation. Pre-personal intelligence is the essence of creative genius and indicates the ultimate quality of conscious thought development. An objective ego is the door to creative consciousness when it begins to realize the multidimensional nature of mind reality. Until then, it is but a personification of subjective reactions, an addiction to the mechanical habits of thought, an inability to differentiate between real thinking and self-indulgence. Objective thought consciousness is fundamental and revolutionary. It increases the level of awareness above and beyond that of present humanity. The evolution of consciousness is related to factors that can be grasped through the mastery of the astral forces that dominate intelligence rooted in an emotional ground. The ego, basically an untutored mass of emotions and opinions, is the source of trickery to the self until the shock of the extent of soul programming has been realized. It has never been made a free agent through a balanced relationship with the higher planes, and therefore remains a permanent sufferer and plaintiff in a life experiment that sustains the soul forces and starves consciousness. The soul as an energy system must be deprogrammed through pre-personal intelligence perceptions of the ego. Until such vision has been achieved, it is impossible for the ego to obtain knowledge of self and its source, having no contact with an all-encompassing reality. Mind communication is a unique vantage point for comprehensive development of the ego. Once this aspect of self-reality has been grasped, the ego no longer opposes its creative dynamics and psychic objectivity. In its unconsciousness, it is but a vehicle of expression for the soul, that unnecessary slave to the astral world from which it came and to which it will return. The soul is memory and the unconscious ego its channel. Once the ego has become aware of the occult laws of the mind, it ceases to be a slave of the soul. It begins using its own forces for the development of a creative partnership with higher planes of the invisible spectrum of intelligence. Conscious destiny is the higher evolution of otherwise dormant psychic sources that correspond to the architecture of the mind. The universe is peopled by intelligences that differ in their scale of experience to ours, due to the quality of the worlds they inhabit. Our short-sighted rational vision makes it difficult for us to imagine reality as being other than what we think. And yet, we easily bring ourselves to communicate with those interdimensional worlds through the mechanical formulation of prayers. Were we closer to our real self, praying would rapidly become an antique form of unconscious communication replaced by direct mental contact through the psychic communication network. We would become acquainted with the intelligent nature of universe reality. The whole basis of subjective life experience is linked to the inability of the ego to extract from its mental experience a higher form of communication. Knowledge that coexists with the lower mental function or intellect. The ego in itself is not a problem as it represents only a portion of the psychic development of consciousness. It becomes a barrier when psychological data is reflected upon, forming the basic illusions of the personality. Instead of objectifying the pre-personal thought flow that surges from the creative relationship with forces that sustain reality beyond psychological experience. The supremacy of psychic evolution over psychological experience is to be found in its multidimensionality. Psychic evolution is the next stage of development of egoic consciousness. One cannot forever live in the absence of a consciousness firmly rooted in the mind. It is not a matter of choice but of evolutionary necessity. Life is basically a never-ending process of development of the physical and subsequently, the psychic portion of human nature. It becomes psychic at the junction of genetic material with consciousness of the cell. The subjective ego is temporarily deficient of the natural link between these two strata of developing life forces. The psyche is the summation of forces that nourish and maintain the genetic material in harmony with cellular consciousness. When this harmony is broken, through either karmic or accidental reasons, it can no longer operate on energy from the higher planes. Astral consciousness takes over and breaks the ego's lifeline to reality. The supramental science of the ego is creative and useful when it raises the awareness of the self and its supporting consciousness. It can be applied from a vantage point that cannot be colored, as it demonstrates the rapport of psychic forces actualized in a more or less manipulative fashion, depending on the degree of egoic maturity. As a creative tool for inner investigation, it takes into consideration not only the human, but also its astral counterpart, as revealed through the power of the soul over the ego in the unconscious phases of the life experience. The inability to engage in a conscious relationship with higher intelligence planes, whose role is to move energy through the mind with ever greater efficiency, creates the experience of doubt and uncertainty, limiting life consciousness to primitive basics. Even those who enjoy a certain amount of freedom from their subjective personality through psychic contact with other planes do not understand the laws of those planes. They are influenced in ways that would shock them out of their fascination, should they become aware of the traps that match the extent of naivety experienced by any psychic who persists in dealing with forces without questioning their origin or light. The new man will challenge all forces that stand above him in the psychic spheres, and will bring his ego to a state of transparency that will clearly separate it from mass consciousness. The price to pay will be high, for he has never experienced what belongs to him: total creative freedom of the mind. It will not be given to him until he himself wrenches it free. There is less love in the invisible world than we want to believe in our emotional and naive spiritual nature. Reality is far more power-based than we can imagine, and human consciousness far from understanding its laws. The universe is not at par with human spiritual ideals. The psychic forces that underlie human mind activities are much more astral than we have been led to believe. And humanity's future role in the evolution of the mind will be to restore its natural order. This will require a minimum degree of creative, objective intelligence that can only be had through the dissolution of the emotional link with spirituality. Until spirituality is freed from emotion and intelligently understood, it will remain the most powerful astral tool on Earth. Regaining full control of conscious thought and creative freedom implies breaking the bonds between the death plane and the real self. Human reality cannot be divided forever. If we are to gain access to our creative partnership with planes of energy which make up the whole of our reality as evolutionary beings, we cannot forego knowledge that belongs to the new age. We are complete in ourselves but partial in spite of ourselves. We can only regain full use of our faculties through the re-evaluation of thinking habits that have forged a personality so far incongruous with our unique identity.